All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Monte Poker episode 29. In this week's episode, we are going to be going over our biggest trip. Finally, don't know if you guys remember, that was from a couple months ago in June when we were out at the World Series and playing the Bar Poker Open tournaments. We ran pretty deep in the tournaments, but unfortunately, we did not do great in cash. Go ahead and jump ahead if you just want to see the poker hands. I will be as quick as I can with this. I had to break it into two screenshots for you guys, but this is our entire cash game session log in Vegas. We started on 6-7 and our last session was 6-15. Sat down at the Nugget for the 1-2, made $60, switched over to the 2-5 game, lost 1,762. Then we didn't play for a day because we were doing the Gladiator, played again on 6-9 for 5 hours, made a little on 200, but then played later that night and lost 4 almost, actually 350, 4 is a stretch. Then on 6-11, we played again for about 4 hours, lost 280. 6-12, we played for a total of 6 minutes, but later that afternoon tried playing again at 8 p.m. lost $725. 6-13 played over at South Point for 7 hours playing 2-3, lost $1,100. Moving over to 6-14 at MGM, we played 1-2 for a little under 3 hours. I made $60, and then 6-15 at South Point again playing 2-3, lost $635. And that little stretch unfortunately brought our bankroll from 9K down to $4,819. Man, it hurts just thinking about it. We're playing a bunch of tournaments for anywhere between 10 to 16 hour stretches. We're playing deep tournaments or multi-day tournaments, trying to bag, get to day 2. And honestly, for me, it was too much. You know, it was way too much. I thought I could handle both, and very clearly I could not. It's kind of embarrassing, to be honest, and I really didn't like talking about it when it initially happened. But then I realized that this is just something that happened in my poker career, you know? Someday in the future, I'm going to look back at this, I'm going to laugh at it, and help use it to encourage others to not beat themselves up when they, you know, make these big mistakes. $5,000 is a really big mistake. I was fortunate enough that, you know, I did well in the tournaments and I got some money back. Fortunately, I don't track that on the channel because we don't do a lot of tournaments and we're doing bankroll challenges for cash. So the hit really wasn't as bad as it seems. But as far as my cash bankroll is concerned, it's massive. I lost half of it. Anyhow, that's enough of that. Enough of the rant. Let's get into the poker hands. All right, ladies and gentlemen, much like last week's video, we are starting this first hand of the vlog off strong with 2 red kings. Can't remember if we had 2 red kings to start off last week's vlog, but what I can remember is that we like to raise premiums pre-flop. Under the gun open to $10. We had a caller in between. I make it $30 to go. It folds around to Margot, who puts in the call, and the player in the middle gets out of the way. $70 in the middle, and we go to this run out that comes 9 ace 5 2 clubs. Of course, the ace magnets strike again. Anytime you have pocket kings and get a caller, an ace always hits the board. Margot checks it over to us and then just shoots us a look from across the table. I don't know what this look means, but it seems pretty suspicious. Normally, I think she would bet the ace here if she had the ace with 2 clubs on the board, but she could also be trying to trap us. So when the action gets over to me, I decide to just go ahead and check it back. The queen of clubs hits the turn, bringing in the front door flush draw, and then Margot starts grabbing some chips. She fires out here for $40. She could be doing this with the flush draw, but I think it's also just as likely that she's doing this with just a queen after we check the flop. So it's a bit too early for us to give up here. So I do decide to put in the call for $40 and see what she does on the river. Playing for $150, and the queen of diamonds comes on the river. Yikes. Very, very unfortunate for us. Margot does not hesitate in grabbing chips and fires for another $40, which to me just smells like value. For my newer players, anytime you hear a poker player said that somebody went for value and made a value sized bet, it means that they're keeping the bet so small that a weaker hand almost has to call. For example, she bet $40 here into a pot of almost 200. So if I had the ace, I would basically have to call off this bet here. But we don't have the ace, so we're losing to the ace. We're also losing to the queens. We're losing to the flush draw. There's really not much we're beating on this board whatsoever. We have a pure bluff catcher. So even though the bet is so small, I do make the discipline fold and throw my pocket kings away, and Margot does show that she had the queen. We had her on the flop, we had her on the turn, and she rivered us for 3 of a kind. Rather unfortunate, but it happens. From this point onward, we don't really see anything too interesting for a little bit. Play a PLO Bomb Pot, flop a set of 4s, potential to make a bigger full house with a king as well. End up scooping a small pot on the turn here, not really getting too much action. And then an hour later, we pick up deuces, and same as before, we end up flopping a set. But unfortunately on this board, there's a 4-liner to a straight out there, so we end up losing this hand. Unable to catch anything for the next hour or so, we end up even shorter, so I add on for another 200 bucks to keep on playing here. After about an hour, I look at a playable hand, queen jack offsuit in early position, and decide to open for $20. We get 2 callers and we get to this flop with jack 9, jack, and 2 spades. I decided to get a little tricky here and check it over to the other 2 players since we're out of position to go for a check raise. But then one of our opponents fires for $45, which leads me to believe that he has a pretty decent hand. Either a good 9, maybe holding the ace of spades, or potentially 2 spades. Queen 10 would also be open-ended here, but we're blocking that, so I don't think he has queen 10. 2 of us put in the call and we go off to this turn with 189 in the middle, which comes a king of clubs. Like I mentioned, I think our opponent that bet either has a 9 or a spade draw, so I'm not really afraid when this king gets here. So I decide to fire for about a third of the pot, $70, and that's when we get min clicked to $140 by the opponent in the middle. He's been pretty passive this hand, so it feels a bit weird when we get min raised by the player that's been pretty quiet thus far. He's also min raising into 2 opponents, so this just looks ridiculously strong. We're losing to ace jack, king jack, chopping with queen jack, losing to jack 9, beating jack 10, and we're losing to queen 10. Problem I'm having in this situation is that there are 2 flush draws and a straight draw available. I have 3 of a kind and I'm blocking the straight draw, and to make things worse, this pot is 400 and I only have about 125 left behind, so I don't think I can fold a hand as strong as this, especially when we can boat up on the river. So for these reasons, I do decide to go all in because that's pretty much the bet sizing he already used. We go off to this river, which comes a 10 of clubs, so we end up making a straight, and our opponent shows us jack 9 for a flopped full house. 6 setup hand, nothing we could really do about that, unfortunately. So it's time for us to reload once again. Let's pick up 200 and see if we can make anything happen with this. Not too much time passes since we rebought, and we look down at another wonderful hand, pocket kings yet again. Let's see if we can actually make some money on them this time. Under the gun bets $15. I decide to increase the price of poker to $30. We get called by the button. Both the blinds fold. The action gets back to the under the gun player, and he decides to put in the call for 15 more. $94 in the middle. We go off to this flop 3 ways, and the board comes out for 7-8 rainbow. Pretty good flop for our overpair here. The action checks over to me, and we're going to continue betting here. I size down to $25, which is about a quarter of the pot, trying to let our opponents catch up here. The button puts in the call. It gets over back to the under the gun player, who eventually puts in the call as well. 169 in the middle, and the turn comes a 6 of clubs. This is a very bad card for us. If we bet anything here, I suspect we're only going to get called by a better hand, so I check the action on the turn. A deuce of clubs on the river doesn't change too much on this board. It checks through again. I show my kings, and it is in fact the best hand somehow. We haven't been able to make much happen this session thus far, so I do end up adding for a couple $100 more here, trying to give ourselves some stack depth, so if we hit a big hand, we can actually make some money. Today's session has unfortunately just been very grindy up till now. We have another deja vu session. We saw kings, queen jack, kings, and now it's time for queen jack yet again, this time of the suited variety. We have an all-in from the hijack for $30. The button called the $30, and I felt like this hand was good enough to see a flop, even though we were out of position considering one player was already all in. We flop second pair with a pretty good kicker, so I decide to put out a little feeler bet and see where we're at in this hand, and bet $40 here into a pot of 90. If our opponent has a king with a good kicker, he'll most likely put in a raise. If he has a king with a weak kicker, kicker, he'll just call. If he has a queen with a pretty good kicker, he'll just call. So in my head, I'm telling myself I'm going to fold to a raise and size up on most cards on the turn if he just flats us. But it seems I forgot the most fundamental rule in poker, and it is knowing how much money your opponents have behind when you get involved in pots with them. I did not realize that the button was short stacked and only had a little bit more than what I already put out there. So when he goes all in, I have to call here for $25 more, even though we're most likely beat. Another king hits the board along with a 2 of spades. I flip over our queen and we're somehow good. The hijack shows ace 9 offsuit, and then the button shows jack 10 offsuit for an open-ended straight draw that completely missed. Our queens and kings with a jack kicker are good. About 10 minutes go by before the next relevant hand comes up. We look down at jack 8 suited on the big blind. There was a $10 open from the under the gun player. The other blind called, so we're going to put in the call for $7. Board comes out 5-5 queen with 2 clubs, so we flop a flush draw. I'm going to go ahead and check to the pre-flop aggressor. He decides to continue here for $15. We're going nowhere, so we put in the call, and the turn comes the ace of clubs, baby. Let's go. We obviously have a pretty solid hand, but the question is, how are we going to get called here? This is the most obvious draw that we would have been on, and if we just decide to fire here, it's going to look very suspicious. If I check it over to our opponent and he checks back, we're going to miss out on a lot of value. So I think the thing that makes the most sense is to go for a value bet now and then go for a big bet on the river. So I decide to lead out here for $25. Our opponent puts in the call pretty quickly, so we're off to this river with 110 in the middle, and it comes the 9 of diamonds. Now it's time to size up, and we're going to do at the minimum a pot size bet, but I'm contemplating whether or not I can get away with going maybe 125 or 150. I do decide to play it safe and just go for $100 here, basically telling my opponent that I have a flush or nothing, so my hand is pretty face up at the moment. He thinks about it for quite some time, I'd say somewhere between 2 to 3 minutes, but eventually does decide to put in the call. We show our jack high flush, our opponent knocks on the table indicating nice hand, and we end up scooping this $310 pot. Last hand of the night brings us to a PLO Bomb Pot. They do this at every dealer change here at Outlaws. It is kept at $100, so there's 10 from each player going in, $70 in the middle. Go to this flop, which comes 6, 7, 5 with 2 hearts. We have the nut flush draw, we have a pair of sixes, we also have a pair of aces in our hand, and we have a gut shot to a 4. Considering how strong our hand is, I do decide to bet $25 here. Because of how many hearts I'm holding, I don't expect other people to have the flush draw. I also have the nut flush draw, so I don't expect too many people to put in a call here if we were to make a very big bet. But our $25 sizing seems to be good because we got a ton of callers, now building this pot up to $170. Off to the turn, and the 4 of hearts peels off. We make our straight, we make our flush, but more important, ladies and gentlemen, we made a straight flush. Not very often that you hit a straight flush, so we have the stone cold nuts in this hand with 4 or 5 people involved. I decide to fire for $35 here. Once again, we're holding a lot of hearts, so I don't expect our opponents to have very many hearts, but there is a straight out there as well, and somebody could have a set trying to hit a full house. I'm trying to get everybody to come along and keep chasing whatever it is that they're chasing, and even better, hopefully hit it so they pay us on the river. There's literally nothing that can beat our hand at the moment, so we want to keep things nice and cheap for everybody to keep bloating this pot. Our plan works, and we get 3 more callers, getting this pot up to 310 as we go to this river, which comes a 3 of diamonds. As we mentioned earlier, this game is capped, so there's nothing left to do but to bet the rest of it, which is $30. Don't expect anybody to call unless they actually hit whatever hand that they were chasing in this situation. Player on the button thinks about it for a moment, but then eventually does put in the call. Small blind's already all in, big blind folds. I show our opponents the bad news, and we scoop this $370 pot to close out the night. Well guys, sorry to say it, but that's all we have for you today. Very reminiscent of our early days and our first couple of episodes on the vlog. Because our bankroll is hurting right now, I had to switch into nip mode and do smaller buy-ins. and play a little bit more conservatively with our money. But to those of you who have recently started playing cash or want to get into cash, this is a much more accurate representation of how it goes. You're often going to have cash game sessions when building your bankroll that don't really produce much results. Play for a couple hours, be dead even, down 50 bucks, up 50 bucks, and that's perfectly okay. It's better for you to have a $50 deficit or $50 increase or be even than for you to be down $300-400 bucks. And since we took that massive L in Vegas, I know I still have a good sized bankroll, but I lost half of it. So my mindset right now is back to bankroll building, as opposed to being a crazy action player that just dumps tons of money in a session. Go watch episode 28 if you haven't yet. You'll know what I'm talking about. Anyhow, as far as session goes, I won't bore you with the on-screen overlay again, but we were down $35 overall on the session, which once again is perfectly okay. I was definitely down a lot more than that. Could have probably stayed longer and tried to push it, but I was like, hey, started at 6 p.m. now 12 o'clock at night. Do we really want to push it? We're almost dead even on the night, better than being down a couple hundred. Do I want to risk losing another 200-300 and being stuck here till 3, 4, 5, 6 in the morning and then leaving maybe potentially even down more than that? Not worth it in my opinion. Done it before, don't want to do it again. So guys, I'll sign off with that, but before I do, I want to thank you all very much. This channel has been a lot of work, but we finally got monetized on YouTube, so you're going to start seeing ads popping up on the channel now. It's a huge milestone for me and I am absolutely stoked about it. Not that we're making a bunch of money or we'll make a bunch of money off of YouTube, not that we'll be living off of YouTube money anytime soon, but it is a great milestone. But now that we've reached that goal, the next goal for us is to launch a merch store. So I'm going to be working on that and you'll see that coming up in the next couple of weeks. I know a ton of you have been asking me for hats. I know a ton of people have been asking me for hats and some hoodies, and unfortunately I've been lagging on it because I'm paying for everything out of pocket and then just giving them to people as a thank you for watching the channel. But from this point moving forward, I'm just going to set up the merch store, and if people want something, they can go buy it themselves, and then I'll use that money to make more merch, and that'll help me advertise and get my name out there. I'm personally not one for cheap clothing that is uncomfortable though, so it's going to take me some time to get a couple samples and pick some hoodies, hats, and other clothing that's actually comfortable and that I would be happy wearing, because I don't want you guys to buy stuff that I wouldn't wear myself. So just give me a couple weeks, maybe a month and a half to get that all set up, and you guys will see a merch store coming soon. All right, that's it for today guys. Thank you so much for stopping by. I will see you next week. Hope you have a good weekend and good luck on the felt.